next speaker is Dr. Jeyanthi Kunadhasan. Jeyanthi was a consultant anaesthetist at a major Victorian public hospital in practice for more than 12 years until she was mandated out in October 2021. She has a clinical interest in patient blood management, where she spearheaded many initiatives that sustainably brought down the unnecessary transfusion rates in major surgeries, leading to improved patient outcomes and lower costs to the health system. Thank you very much, Dr. Jeyanthi.
Thank you, Cara. The slides are not running. Thank you. So when I first got fired last year from my regional Victorian public hospital because of vaccine mandates, I think for the first few weeks, I used to wake up in the morning and get ready as if I was going for work. So those of us who have survived all of that, there's been a lot of trauma. And part of my survival mechanism to survive that trauma of that horrible experience was I joined a lot of things. So I joined AMS, and I was already a member of AMS, so I became more active in AMS. And one of the other things I joined was this very amazing volunteer effort. So it's 3,500 volunteers from around the world. We've come together to analyze the Pfizer documents that were the basis of the EUA. So it's hundreds of thousands of documents. No one person could have done it. And it's actually the story of how the volunteers came together to analyze the documents is the story, but right now we are more interested in getting the story of what we found in the documents first. So I'm presenting this presentation on behalf of my co-authors, Ed Clark and Dr. Chris Flowers, as well as the amazing data team and other members of the War Room Pfizer DailyClout volunteers. Well, you can look at the map, which I'll explain. All right, so that's report number 42 on the DailyClout site, published in September. And since then, sort of requires 2 clicks, or many clicks. Am I supposed to click something else, or? And since I've published that, I've sort of reanalyzed a few more data and published those findings today in The Spectator, so you can read that as well. Now, it doesn't like me clicking. All right. So the documents were uploaded on the Public Health and Medical Professionals for Transparency, so they sued the FDA for the information to be public, the documents that were the basis of the Pfizer EUA. They didn't want you to know this for 75 years. I wonder why. And so it's the DailyClout volunteers, and that's our site, that we are the ones who are actually analyzing. And I don't think there's actually been other organizations that have analyzed it the same way we have. Now, the words safe and effective have been really drummed into us. You know, it's been blared in every TV screen and every loudspeaker and every premiere. But I'm not going to address the safety issues. I'm not going to address the safety issues here today. I'm not going to talk about the utility of the construct of the trial, the utility of using this parameter or not. I'm actually just going to talk about the 170 patients that were the basis of the claim that this drug is effective. Now, when I say 170 patients, people get really flummoxed. Like, this trial had 44,000 patients. How dare you say it was only based on the results of 170 patients? So it's quite a lot for people to get their heads around. And essentially, this is the EUA memorandum. And just look through the words. It generally says final analysis of efficacy of the vaccine against confirmed COVID-19 infection 7 days after dose 2 in participants without evidence of SARS-CoV. And it's 162 who got the placebo and 8 who got the vaccine. That gave them a vaccine efficacy of 95%, and they said that they met a predefined success criteria. So yippee, we have an effective vaccine, and those are the 170 patients. Now, and they sort of always did it, like it was always in plain sight. They would have a very big trial, and the results of how they declared this vaccine was efficacious was going to be in just a small number of people. So this was because they said in June 2020, because of the rapidly evolving pandemic situation, we need to declare vaccine efficacy as soon as possible. So if we think that with a disease probability of about 1%, we need about 30,000 patients. But if you think about it, so this is a trial seeing how successful this vaccine is in preventing infection. So your endpoint is going to be people who got infection and comparing the incidence in the vaccinated group versus the placebo group. So they needed only 164 patients of confirmed viral illness. So that was the primary endpoint in the EUA, and it was very specific. Like you could only get sick 7 days after dose 2. You couldn't get sick beforehand, and obviously you had to have no evidence of infection. So that makes sense as well, and they aimed for 164. So that just talks about who qualified to be part of this 170, and they confirmed it by doing swab. So that's that NAAT. And you only needed one type of symptom, one symptom. So it's interesting in medicine, like, anesthesia in intensive care, it's like 3 out of 5 symptoms and stuff like that. But this was just one symptom. It could even be just diarrhea or vomiting. But if your swab was positive, 7 days after dose 2, you could qualify to be part of the 170. Now, this is the most important patient population in this trial. So you think it'd be the easiest thing that you could find. And if there are hundreds of thousands of pages, it should have been in the first data dump, isn't it? And it should have been like page 1. But no. So you got to go through you got to understand how they've dumped the documents, but this was in the interim lab measurements, and that came in 3 tranches. And basically you needed 2 of the 3 tranches. But even in that 671-page document, it was in page 586. So you have to give me some credit for scrolling determinedly to try and find this 170. So it was in 2 of those documents. And one thing you have to understand is that patients that were in that document weren't in that document. Patients that were in that document weren't in that document. And so we had to reconcile the list and make sure we got the 170. Where else were they found? They were found in the interim narratives section of the Pfizer data dump. And so in this interim narratives, they actually had an almost perfect record of the entire patient journey through the trial. So they didn't do this for many patients. They only did it for about 600 plus. And you had to go through the deaths, adverse events, etc., and come to a segment that was evaluable and or severe. So even in that side, you had to push away the patients who were severe COVID and just look for your evaluable efficacy population. So they really didn't want you to find it that easily. Now, we got the 170, and then the first question is going to be asked is, how do you know your 170 is the real 170? So what we did is we cross-matched publicly available demographic data that was available in the New England Journal of Medicine. So that's the data on age, sex, race, and country. And the other one is found in the appendix section of the New England Journal of Medicine, and that was the obesity data, and we had a perfect match. So we're pretty happy. Our 170 is the 170 patients that changed. The original title of this talk was Change the World. It definitely changed my world. Right now, that changed everything. It's changed everyone's world. So now, we found the 170. Does it matter? It should be all right. It should be the most perfect patient population in the world. Because based on the results of this patient population, they took away our jobs, essentially, isn't it? So now, let's look back. So my slides actually had like sliding in and sliding out that have now all mingled into one. So this was essentially the EUA documentation, and it was just going through the patient population that we had. Like, it started with 20,000+, and then we excluded people and, not eligible for certain criteria. So we're just coming to what was documented in the EUA, where they said reason for exclusion, because, not everyone goes through a trial perfectly, and you can't use all the data. And one of the reasons for exclusion was those who did not receive vaccination as randomized within the predefined window, which is now my new favorite word, in 19 to 42 days after dose 1. And, that sounds pretty innocuous, 19 to 42 days, okay. But the protocol, and that's generally my face when I read the Pfizer documents. Suddenly the clicker's working. Sorry, I'm trying to go back. It's not part of the slideshow. All right. Back to that's my face when I look at Pfizer documents. So why am I so upset about 19 to 42 days? And I am sorry, because there was going to be animations. But essentially, we have to remember when this trial started, from the original protocol to Protocol Amendment 4, they didn't know ostentatiously what drug they were going to give, what dose, the dosing interval between 21 days and 60 days, and they also didn't know whether they just wanted to give one dose of the vaccine or 2 doses. But on Protocol Amendment 5, on the 24th of July 2020, they said, following regulatory feedback, we've decided, we've picked a drug. It's a 2-dose, 21-day. Okay, it's a 2-dose, 21-day apart, 30 microgram Pfizer vaccine. So they've decided on it, and let's look at it. It's 21 days apart. And in the vaccination schedule, so if you look through the protocol, it has 3,500 pages. It's wonderful reading. In the schedule, after Protocol Amendment 5, it just writes there 19 to 23 days, because it's human nature. If you decided on a 21-day dosing schedule, for some variants, they've allowed 19 to 23 days. Next slide. All right, so so that's the start. So 27th of July was the start of the phase 3 of this trial. So now they started the trial. Earlier on, they said they needed 30,000 people. Now they've got a drug, they've got a dose, they've got a dosing interval, 21 days. Now the trial has started, but then we have, curiously, Protocol Amendment 6 on the 8th of September 2020. And what they say is, oops, we need to increase the sample size now by 14,000. Something's happened. And one thing that I've learned is everything's very innocuous. The language is so innocuous when they write it, but it means a lot. So in the summary of the protocol changes, they say we're updating the analysis population descriptions to align with the study SAP. The study SAP is the Statistical Analysis Plan. It's a document not normally seen by PIs. It's generally by the drug company and the FDA. So something's going to be aligned in this SAP. Next slide. So what are the analysis sets? So this is it. So in protocol amendment, so everywhere in the protocol, they will sort of summarize what they're going to analyze. So in Protocol Amendment 6, so dose 1 immunogenicity, they just say it's an appropriate window. But in Protocol Amendment 5, they actually, you can't see it, I'm sorry, but it's actually 21 days. They could put a number. But now it's just a window. And everything now aligns, and to know this window, you just have to look at the SAP. But nobody else knows the window, not the PIs who are working on the thing that they have to do this within 21 days. Next slide. So does it matter? I'm talking so much about these windows. Does it matter if you change the dosing interval of a drug, this drug, from 21 days to 43 days in this trial? So essentially, we analyzed that in our paper. And this is generally the deviations. And this is the data cutoff date, the 14th of November. And you remember you need 7 days after dose 2. So essentially, the most important thing here is that by changing a 42-day dosing interval, where you would have to not accept 1,581 patients because they were outside the dosing interval, you now could accept them, and you could essentially recover 1,410 patients. And next slide. Most importantly, those were 5 of our 170 population. So you might say, I'm nitpicking. I've had many conversations about nitpicking. So, but the 18th days apart, that's 1 day. That's not being accepted. That's how we run trials. So now that this is more than 23 days, 24, 25, 26, why is that accepted? Next slide. So the importance of looking at the statistical analysis plan. Remember, this is a document that most people would not have had access to. Now, the thing to realize is the statistical analysis plan for the third phase of the trial, which was actually finalized on the 2nd of November. Chronologically, the first phase of the trial, that was finalized on the 18th of November. So there's something interesting going on here, because that's an earlier phase. Wouldn't you have finalized that ages ago, isn't it? And then in the study design, they still say it's a 2-dose, 21-day schedule. Wonderful. And what is the implication? What is the real importance of the statistical analysis plan? It's here. It can modify what is outlined in the protocol where appropriate. However, any major modifications of the primary endpoint definition or their analysis will be reflected in a protocol amendment. Now, there have been 14 protocol amendments. They have never amended the dosing interval of this drug. The question has never been asked, why is it appropriate to essentially double the dosing interval of a novel drug in the first trial of this drug? And you have to remember, in earlier phases of this trial, phase 1, they only examined a 21-day dosing interval. The other question that should be asked of Albert Bola, where is the immunological patient-level data to justify a 42-day dosing interval? Next slide. What's so magical about 42 days? 41 days is okay, 43 days is not. Where's the patient-level data? Let's look at it. So, next slide. So remember we said in the SAP, and remember I showed you statistical analysis sets in the protocol. But remember, you can't just, examine nothing. You need a number. Generally, you analyze numbers. So in the statistical analysis sets of the SAP, remember it came out on the 2nd of November. So they're sort of finalizing this pretty late in the game, isn't it? In our evaluable efficacy population, that's the 170 population, the 19 to 42 days come out. Throughout the protocol, it was 21 days. Suddenly, there's 19 to 42. And it gets even more interesting for the same variable, the immunogenicity data. For phase 1, let's examine it 21 days apart. But for phase 2, let's examine it 19 to 42 days apart. Now, let's look back at what they say about the evaluable efficacy, our 170 patient population. These lines, a major protocol deviation will exclude a participant from the evaluable efficacy population from the date it occurs. That makes sense. If you're going to declare a drug effective, you generally want to declare that on the patient population that had gone through the protocol correctly. I mean, That's just, common sense. So let's look at this patient who was in our 170 patient population from the relevant tables. Next slide. But that patient also made it into this list. And I apologize you can't see it, but if you go through my articles, you can see it there. This is a list of important protocol deviations. And what protocol deviation is it? They didn't receive the correct dose of the investigational product. Now, I think that's pretty major, and that's the thing that really got me. And if you're going to take away my job, can you at least make sure the patient population you make that decision on could have at least, the minimum you could have done is they received the correct dose of the investigational product. Next slide. This is another patient, again found in our 170 population, and then also made it into this list in which they had a receipt of blood product within 60 days, which is protocol deviation number 15. So essentially, this is truly the speed of science. They said they wanted 164 patients, so with our 5 patients plus these 2 protocol deviations, from 170 it comes to 163. So they didn't even reach actually the threshold they said they needed to reach to even do the analysis. And then we had 2 other patients that were withdrawn before the issuance of the EUA. And one of those patients actually were upset with how they were medically managed in the trial. And then we had another patient who had illness. They had 2 episodes of illness. So after the first episode of illness, they had an episode of illness 2 days after dose 2. So remember, that's disqualifying because you can only get 6-7 days after. But then they did a swab on this patient 18 days later. Now, if you're going to swab me 18 days later, most likely I'm going to test negative. And then thankfully the patient got sick again and then got sick in the right interval and made it into the 170. So it's wonderful. Another thing, when I was compiling the list, I had 1 set of sequential numbers. That's okay. 2 sets. Interesting. I had 6 pairs of sequential numbers in a list of 170 patients from a potential population of about 37,000. Think of that. Think of random selection and think of how you get 6 pairs of sequential numbers. Interesting, isn't it? So some people said we couldn't use the Monte Carlo simulation because it's a highly transmissible disease. And if you look at the patient vignettes, quite likely it was a mother-daughter or a partner relationship. Next slide. But if it's a transmissible disease, it wasn't very transmitted in the more densely populated parts of the US. So one of our data friends kindly mapped our 170 patient population. So each dot is a contribution of where our 170 patient population came from. So you can see Argentina, outsized contribution, the infamous site 1231, and that is combined with 4444. That's Nebraska. Not much contribution on the eastern and western seaboard. So that's really interesting as well. Now, when I first published the paper, I didn't think I could actually get the accrual or the time frame in which the 170 population was actually, when they would have found their patients in that 170 population. So this is a surrogate measure because I'm using date of diagnosis. But the problem is they didn't uniformly document date of diagnosis in the documents as well. So sometimes I became like the arbiter and I just took the date the swab was taken. Before I go and talk about that, I just want to go through their plan of how they were. Remember, we had to find vaccine efficacy as soon as possible. And then there were times where they talked about the interim analysis. So they planned to do interim analysis at 32 cases. So they didn't do it. They publicly said they couldn't do it at 32 cases. The next interim analysis was planned at 62. Then there's 92, and the final threshold was at 64. Now, just look at the boundaries of efficacy and futility. And look at the number 53 here and the number 15 there. So basically, next slide, if you had more than 54 patients vaccinated in this population for your primary endpoint, this vaccine would have been declared not effective. All right, now let's look at the next slide. So this is the accrual towards the 170 on the different dates. 14th of November is data cutoff. So if we think about it, when 62 cases plus will be somewhere here, which is the last week of October. And if you think, remember I said more than 15 cases, the vaccine couldn't be efficacious, but they only have like 3 vaccinated patients here. This would have been like the most efficacious drug on earth. They could have told us that by the end of October, but they didn't. And when we talked about the 170 patient population, we asked statisticians, we've got now 163 patients, what's the vaccine efficacy? And they said it's still about 90-something%. So the story doesn't end with us finding the 170. The story continues with finding those who didn't make it into the 170 patient population. So this is a slide of patients who were excluded from the trial. Those are the dates. That's the data cutoff date there. And suddenly on the 16th, so data cutoff date is the 14th of November, and that's the 16th of November. And that's a big spike. Lots of people are being excluded on that day. And if you look at it, that color, those are vaccinated. So proportionately, a lot more vaccinated patients are being excluded from the trial. Something's happening, isn't it? We don't know. I can't comment on it because we don't have that patient level data. But there must be a reason why 181 patients were excluded the day after the data cutoff. We need to know. Now, if you think about exclusion, so we've analyzed certain sites. So this is Mr. Darrell Harrington. He had his own predefined window. His predefined window was 75 days to 100 days between dose 1 and dose 2. And if you think about it, when's a predefined window, isn't it? When are you defining this predefined window? But if you had a PI like him, your exclusions between vaccinated and placebo would be equal. It wouldn't be like the graph that I showed you. So this is something that we've sort of plotted with the timeline again with certain important events. So that was the date that they could first possibly have the primary endpoint. And I like it that on the 3rd of September, when the Pfizer CEO says that I can have a successful vaccine by October, he actually had like 0 cases of this final efficacy population. He didn't have a thing. But already by then, they were excluded about 300 patients, proportionately about 200 vaccinated. And when they said they needed extra patients, Protocol Amendment 6, to have 14,000 extra patients, they only had 1 patient in this 170 population. Interesting, isn't it? And then that was the day, where's this pointer? All right, so that was the day of the debate, the day after the debate. So in this contracts, between the government, they were supposed to deliver vaccine by the 31st of October 2020. So that's why during the debate, there was a president that said we'll have a vaccine by the end of October. And then the next day, there was pushback. We will not have this vaccine. So by that time, they only had 16 cases. So remember, they couldn't do interim analysis 1. Just go back. One slide back. Yep. So then they only had 16 cases. Now they accrued 95 cases, and think about that number on the 31st of October. And on this date, the 4th of November, 1 day after a very important event, the FDA said that they had accrued 94 cases. We showed they would have probably had about 112 by then. By the time we came towards the data cutoff, they had about 1,000 plus cases excluded, 800 vaccinated, 300 placebo. Interesting, isn't it? And if you think about it, I said this is a surrogate measure. I'm taking the date of diagnosis. It couldn't be more than a day from the date of diagnosis to Pfizer being able to say they have these cases, because the last case for our 170 came on the 13th of November. Next slide. So this is again the EUA documentation pretty much saying that they had 94 cases on the 4th of November, and we showed that they probably reached that 31st of October. So I'm going to finish now. Next slide. So I think about why do this? Because it's been a very, very difficult road. And there's some people, even on our side of the football, some doctors say, they tell me like, I want to keep working. Well, I want to keep working too. I just want to be able to turn up for work with a sense of honor. We don't talk about honor. We don't talk about honor much in society today. It's a clickbait society. It's easy, it's just instant retribution. But honor's been important in formulating the types of society we live in, from the time of Aristotle to the time of Winston Churchill. And I think of my journey when I started. I never thought that I would have it in me to be able to pass the Australian exam, because I migrated from Malaysia. I saved for 2 years to be able to take the Australian exam. So I didn't think I could pass it. But I didn't save for 2 years to practice the kind of medicine that needs to be enforced with the help of rubber bullets. And the medical leadership in this country, it has dismayed me. Like, I don't care what politicians say. I don't expect very much from them. I expect a lot more from my fellow doctor. Thank you.
It's Naomi Wolf of DailyClout, and I am asking you to please, if you like the video you just saw, support us, become a member, donate. You can send checks to P.O. Box 24, Millerton, New York, 12546, or go to DailyClout, DailyClout, become a member or donate. Thank you so much for your support. Every penny goes for paying our hardworking staff, paying hosting costs, and paying our lawyers who have been leading the fight to keep you safe and free, to keep the Constitution safe and to keep you free. Thank you so much.